Hello again. Welcome to our channel, Mundelein Church in the Nazarene, and our 32nd installment, our episode of our journey through the New Testament. Now, I know there's some little letters, little books of the New Testament that we've skipped, just because they don't create enough discussion or critical mass to really base an episode on. But this is our last book of the New Testament, and today we want to talk about the book of Revelation. It is easily the most misunderstood book in all the Bible. And so we want to take a little bit of a time today and maybe clear up some common misconceptions that we have about the book of Revelation. So the first one is the name itself. The name Revelation, in Greek, it comes from the word apocalypse. Now, we all know, at least we think we do, what the word apocalypse means. We think the word apocalypse means the end of the world. Well, this is one of those cases where bad theology has bled over into the actual definition of a word. In Greek, the word apocalypse does not mean the end of the world. It doesn't mean anything bad. It doesn't mean disaster. It doesn't even mean the end of the world. The simple meaning of the word is the revealing. So think about a theater curtain. You're in downtown Chicago. You're at a Broadway musical, and it's the lights dim and the opening scene is about to happen, and the curtain pulls back and you see the scenery behind it. That's an apocalypse. You're literally able to see something that's been there all along, but only now has been opened up for you to view with your own eyes. That's what the word apocalypse means. And so when we get to the book of Revelation, a common feeling, a common belief out there is that Revelation is a book about future events that haven't happened yet. And if we'll just be able to find the key to Revelation, we'll understand what's going to happen in the future. Well, let's talk first about what's right with that statement. Nothing. Revelation is not about the future, ever. It's never been about the future. Revelation is always about the present. We understand the present. If it's about the future, you would have to believe this, that here was a book that talks about things that no one understood, about a time that no one could comprehend, with people that no one could imagine. And even though here's this book about all these events and things and themes that no one could even think about, they read it and went, wow, this is so good, we have to keep it. They kept it, they treasured it, they copied it, they passed it down because it met their need and it addressed their world. So Revelation has always been about the present. Let's talk about what kind of literature it is. While apocalypse is strange to us, apocalypses were very common forms of literature back around the first century. There's a number of them. There's books behind me that contain a number of apocalypses written roughly at the same time. None of these are in the Bible because no one kept them. They were common forms, and here's what an apocalypse contained. Normally, it is a strange or supernatural or otherworldly being took a hero or known person on a journey and showed him things that would not otherwise be seen. So it's a journey through a world ushered by a supernatural being. So think about, you're all familiar, and in fact a month or two you'll start to see it. Ebenezer Scrooge, A Christmas Carol, one of the favorite plays or movies from a lot of people. My favorite version is not the Patrick Stewart version. No, and it wasn't the musical version with Kelsey Grammer. That's terrible. Of course, the classic George C. Scott version. So if you remember, you have the Ghost of Christmas Present. And he comes and takes Ebenezer Scrooge on a tour, and they go to Tiny Tim's house. And they see Bob Cratchit and his family sitting around dinner. It's a very small turkey. And then toward the end, Ebenezer Scrooge sees that Tiny Tim's chair is empty. And he says, he wonders to the Ghost of Christmas Present, is this something that might be or something that will be? So in that in that movie, Ebenezer Scrooge is taken on a journey by a spirit and is allowed to see the present, and his journey to the present is expected to change Ebenezer Scrooge's behavior. That movie is an apocalypse. Revelation is an apocalypse. This person named John, now we don't know who that is. It wasn't a disciple. Revelation was not written by the Apostle John. When we did 1 John and when we did the Gospel of John, we already talked about this. But this was written quite late, maybe in the mid to late 90s. For John to have written this, he would have been at a very advanced age, in his 90s or so, at a time when most people lived to be about 40, in a time before cataract surgery. And it is virtually impossible for such an intricate book to be written in Greek by a Galilean who's in his 90s. Now, it could have been the person who was in charge of the church in Ephesus, which might have been another John. But once he dies and they start to edit his sermons and his teaching, we get the Gospel of John and later 1 John. This is probably written by someone from that community, and this John, who they knew, the leader, that's the name that gets taken on this journey. That's a very common way for apocalypse to happen. And so he was just the figure that everybody would have known about. So there's a lot of themes. First of all, in the first 3 chapters, there are specific instructions given to 7 churches. These are real people, real places, and they're in the order that one would journey to them if one were on foot. And by the way, they kind of match the conditions that we read about. For instance, in Pergamum, there was a temple there. And in this temple, they had an altar to Zeus. And the local term for this altar was the throne of Satan. Well, look at the letter to the church of Pergamum. You'll find those words. We also have a letter to the Laodiceans. Let's talk about that just for a second. Laodicea was in the bottom of a valley. On one side of the valley were the hot springs of Hierapolis. You can Google it. Google hot springs Hierapolis, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Gleaming white cliffs. Well, there's geologic thermal activity there. Hot water, like at Yellowstone, bubbles to the surface, and tourists go, and they climb up on these cliffs, and they sit in this very hot water. Well, even in the ancient world, it was kind of viewed as having medicinal qualities. You know, they soaked in it, and they felt good when they got out, kind of like a hot tub. And as the water cools, the chemicals like the sulfur kind of leaches out of it. That's what creates these white cliffs. You can look it up. On the other side of the valley was a town called Colossae. Well, it's the letter to the Colossians. Colossae was famous for a different reason. It was at the foothills of a range of mountains, mountains that stayed snow-covered year long. So whether it was June, August, September, there was snow in the mountains, and ice-cold streams came down off that snowmelt. We have journal entries from the Roman army of how wonderful and refreshing and clean the drinking water was at Colossae. They would fill up their containers, their canteens, because the water was so good. So on one side you had the hot water, the other side you had ice-cold water. In the bottom of the valley was the Laodiceans. Now, that town had water carried to it by an aqueduct. Roman Empire was the first to have indoor plumbing. Its water came through the pipes, and some of this water came from, the hot springs. And as it came down, it combined with the cold water from Colossae, and it formed a river that went through Laodicea. But when that cold water hit the hot water, it made a lot of the minerals and chemicals leach out, and it didn't take long at all for their aqueduct and pipes to really close off. But Laodicea was famous for something else. When that hot water hit that cold water, all of a sudden it wasn't quite as refreshing. And the minerals kind of leached out, and it was famous for having a foul smell. And the water was terrible to drink. Imagine if you have a grandparent or aunt and uncle lives out on the farm and they have well water and it's not the best well water. Well, it was known for being terrible water. If you look at the letter to the Laodiceans, God in this letter says to them, I have this one thing against you. You're neither hot nor cold, but lukewarm. And because of that, I spit you out of my mouth. Now, I bet you've heard this sermon before. You've heard some preacher stand in front of a church and say, God would either want you on fire for God or just running away from him. He doesn't like people in the middle. So hot is good, cold is bad, but he'd rather have you one or the two and not be in the middle. It might be a fine sermon, but it's totally not based on Revelation. Because in Revelation, there's not a hint that the cold water's bad. Hot water's good. Cold water's good. The problem is they'd lost their distinctiveness. They quit being who they were created to be. And instead, they just became not much good to anybody. That's a different message than the one you've heard, because we've taken time to go back into the history of Revelation. So when you get to the end, the other great thing about Revelation at the end, I did want to share two more things. The first one is the image of Revelation is not that if we'll make it, we'll get to go to heaven someday, but the ending image of Revelation is God brings heaven here. So when someone asks me what heaven's like or what eternal life is like, I don't know, but I'm going to get fairly close with this answer. Imagine your favorite place, the most beautiful place in the world. And it's the perfect weather. And by the way, there's no thistles that will stick you. There's no thorns. There's no bees that will sting. And it's the perfect weather. And it's just, you're surrounded by the people you love with no agendas, no disease, no delay, no decay, no death. And you say, I just wish time would stand still. I'd love to sit in this kind of place forever. Now you're starting to talk about it. Kind of like that. It won't be different and separate from here. Just remade, renewed, and perfected. I hope that helps. Revelation was written at a time of intense persecution. Domitian was reigning. There was intense persecution. And sometimes Christians were imprisoned or jailed or killed. Imagine living in a time and a place where you didn't know from one week to the next if soldiers wouldn't come and arrest your mom, your dad, your children, your siblings, your good friends, and you'd never see them again. Imagine being in a place you didn't have a vote. You couldn't determine your economic future. You couldn't determine what you did for a living. Everything was determined for you. You had zero power. The customer was not always right. Caesar was always right. Jesus was not Lord. Caesar was Lord. That's the world you lived in. If Revelation's about the future, then much of it becomes meaningless. In the first verses of Revelation chapter 8, it starts off with this phrase, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. Now, here's what we do. We're in our Bible studies. We read chapter 8. We read those verses, and we immediately skip over what's happening next because we don't see anything. There's no armies of heaven. There's no archangel. There's no battle. There's no throne. There's no lightning. There's no music being sung. There's nothing going on. So we got nothing going on here, and we move on to what happens next. We forget that Revelation is written to people with a Jewish background. The people that wrote, be still and know that I am God. The people that wrote, he leads me beside still waters where he restores my soul. The people that considered the Sabbath day holy because that's the day nothing happened. So if you're Jewish and you're reading there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour, you sit up straight because you know something big is about to happen. In our world, we do music and billboards and those cross beam lights that crisscross in the sky at night. We put flyers up and all kind of things to let you know that something big's about to happen. In the Jewish world, I mean, it was when nothing happened that something momentous was about to be described. And then you see the words. There's an angel who was given much incense to offer together with the prayers of the saints. Now that's ancient language, but let me just paraphrase it a different way. There was silence in heaven for about a half an hour because the prayers of God's people were making their way to heaven. God stops all his activity in heaven just to listen to his people pray. If Revelation is about the future, this verse and a lot of other parts of Revelation become meaningless. There's a lot in life back then. They didn't know who was going to be alive. They had zero power. Rome had everything. Palestine had nothing. The church had nothing. They were being persecuted. They didn't know if they were going to live or die in the weeks and months ahead. And they cried out to God, and here's the message. There might not be a miracle for you, but I will guarantee you this. Caesar doesn't listen, but the God of the universe listens and stops all his activity just to hear you pray. Now, we don't live in that culture. We live in a culture where the customer's always right, and we have bank accounts, and we get a vote, but there's a lot of life where we can feel powerless, especially coming back from a doctor who might have just delivered bad news. Maybe the place we work just closed up shop. Maybe our IRA just took a big tumble, and we feel powerless, so we cry out to God. I don't know that everything's always going to be perfect. I don't know everything's going to be right, but I do know this, that when we stop and pray, God stops all his activity in heaven just to hear your voice. That's the message of Revelation. We've ruined it. The early believers, they read each other the book of Revelation and were comforted by the words. It gave them hope. The fact that we read it and get tense or get scared should be the very first sign that we are reading it wrongly. We don't need to do that anymore. Get in touch with it maybe for the first time. Read it for the first time like it was meant to be written. Not as some future code book, but as a present day book to give you a measure of comfort you didn't have before. That's Revelation. Hey, send us a question this week. I want to answer it. Tell me I'm wrong. Challenge me. Ask me something about it. We're happy to answer it next week. We want you to like this episode, like this video, or just subscribe to our channel. Please join us back next week as we'll be back hopefully to answer some questions from Revelation. I'll see you again soon. Bye.